Okay, now we move into our gospel, which is Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, and then verses 19 through 23. When the Magi had departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod had died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. He rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. And because he had been warned in a dream, he departed for the region of Galilee. He went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. Okay, so there's a little bit of a tricky thing, because next weekend, for the Feast of the Epiphany, we're going to hear the first part of this gospel passage. So we're going to be out of order a little bit. And in addition, we skip over a chunk that I think is very revealing about the age of Jesus at the time of all of this taking place. So the part that we skip over, verses 16 through 18, is the massacre of the innocents. So when Herod reveals that the Magi departed by another way, he gets angry, and so he has all the babies killed 2 years old and younger in the region where Jesus was said to have been staying. So given that context, I'm sure I'll mention this next week as well, but given that context, it appears to be the case that Jesus is not an infant any longer, but perhaps is even older, because there's quite a significant difference between an infant and a 2-year-old. And so Herod is he ascertains the time between when the star appears and the Magi come. And anyway, so we'll talk more about that next week, I'm sure. But it's just a really interesting point. We think of this story as, like Joseph and Mary and the infant baby, like just a few days old or something. And maybe it's more likely that he was more than a few days old, actually, because, we know that Jesus was presented in the temple, at the 40th day after his birth, and he was presented to the temple. And then, later on, they went to go live in Egypt. They wouldn't have gone to Egypt and then come back to the temple, because Jesus's life still would have been at risk. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing to ponder about. We don't know all the exact details. Okay. But what's going on here? So the Magi have just come. They presented their gifts. They depart and go back to the land of the east. And from there, then it says, the Magi said they depart. The angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. So a person, helpful point here. Matthew's gospel, it seems to be the case. It seems very clearly to be the case. Matthew's gospel is written primarily for a Jewish audience. Whether those people are Jewish people who have converted to Christianity, or whether he's trying to convert the Jewish people to Christianity, or maybe both, he's clearly writing for a Jewish audience, because he makes so many references to Old Testament prophecies. As an example, at the end of this paragraph, it says that he stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I have called my son. So we'll talk about that. But he's making a reference to the prophet, and who's going to know the prophecies of what we would call the Old Testament, but the prophecies of Scripture, but the Jewish people. The Gentile audience is not going to be nearly as familiar. They might still be familiar, but not nearly as familiar as, like these references that Matthew is making. Like who's going to know, like, oh yeah, that's from the book of Hosea, toward the end of that book. No one's going to know that except the Jewish people, because they were very familiar with their scriptures. So Matthew is writing from that perspective. So writing from that perspective, he writes about a man named Joseph who has a dream, and during his dream he encounters the angel of the Lord, or a messenger of the Lord. Who's that going to make you think of? Well, it's going to make you think of Joseph from the Old Testament, actually. And it's not like Matthew's making up this person of Joseph in the New Testament, but perhaps the Lord is working with like a familiar story to create a connection with this new story. That like the Lord can work in that way, that he can call a man named Joseph to be the guardian of Jesus and Mary. he can make that happen because he's the Lord. He can do that kind of thing. So anyway, so it's just kind of a neat connection there that we can see Joseph in the Old Testament, which the Jewish people would be very familiar with. And now we see Joseph in the New Testament. The Lord speaks to Joseph in a dream in the Old Testament, and he speaks to Joseph in a dream in the New Testament, and brings about, as a result of this, brings about his purposes. And as it turns out, Joseph in the Old Testament, not necessarily through the dream, but he ends up in Egypt. And now what happens with Joseph in the New Testament? Through the dream, he ends up in Egypt. Again, just a really, neat thing. I say that word neat a lot, I think, actually. But anyway, whatever. So he appears to Joseph in a dream. So an angel, what is an angel? An angel is a messenger. That word means messenger. So an angel is a messenger of the Lord. He appears. So angels, we teach, don't normally have an appearance because they're invisible spirits. But the Lord can allow them to have an appearance. Like, for example, when Gabriel appears to Mary in the night and tells her that she's going to conceive a son. And that son's going to be named Jesus. So the angels can have appearances given to them by God, although ordinarily they do not have an appearance. So this angel appears to Joseph in a dream, and he says, "Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So who is Herod? Okay, again, we'll probably talk about this more next week, but Herod is this puppet king. He's a false king, an invalid king set up by the Caesar, the Roman Empire, and he's like half Jewish, half not Jewish. And so he sometimes tries to go out of his way to prove that he's like a valid king, even though he's not actually a valid king. Herod is known to have been incredibly paranoid. Historical documents talk about how he had his wife and several of his children killed because he was paranoid that they were going to try to take his throne from him. And so he's a wicked, tyrant, cruel king set up by the Roman Empire. And we, again, hear of the story that we'll hear next week, although if you just read Matthew chapter 2, the first part, you'll get the story all by yourself. But we hear that he's even paranoid when he hears about this newborn king of the Jews. He gives a show to the Magi like he's going to go worship this newborn king, when in fact he really wants to end this newborn king. So it's a really tragic thing, and the Lord sees this. So the Lord from the heavens is seeing this. He's like, okay, I gotta direct traffic here, and so he sends Joseph to direct traffic. And so Joseph rises. He's obedient to God. So getting back to that obedience, to be obedient to the Lord is to have that fear of the Lord is really like a base level of what our families are meant to have. So Joseph rises. He takes the child and his mother by night and departs for Egypt. Now, here's a really interesting thing. So we'll talk more about this in our next session, but Mary didn't have that dream. So imagine, Joseph wakes up from his sleep and he says to Mary, "Hey, an angel appeared to me and we got to go." Where do we got to go? To Egypt. Imagine Mary, she's like, what are you talking about? And yet she believes him, or at least she goes with him. She follows his lead. That's going to be a really important point for our next reading, because we're going to encounter some difficulties, potential difficulties, culturally speaking, with that. But anyway, so that's I guess a little bit of a cliffhanger. Anyway, so he stays in Egypt until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Out of Egypt I called my son." So that's from Hosea 11:1. And in this, of course, we know from the Exodus that the people of God, the Israelites, were in Egypt, and the Lord called them out by Moses to cross through the Red Sea, to be in the desert, etc. So while that whole thing is taking place, the Lord establishes a covenant with them on Mount Sinai, and he refers to his people, the Israelites, as his firstborn son. So when Hosea is writing about this, "Out of Egypt I called my son," he's really referring to the entire people of God that were called out of Egypt, out of that place of slavery, into freedom. And now Matthew is looking at that prophecy, that passage, and he's saying now there's like a new Exodus taking place, and it's taking place in the person of the true Son of God, Jesus. So it's again a neat thing that Jesus is being identified with the Son of God, as referred to the people of God. He is taking on the identity of Israel. And he is also going back to where the Israelites were, so that he could be called out of them to ultimately fulfill that prophecy, to bring about a new Exodus. A very neat thing. Okay, so then when Herod dies, the angel comes back to Joseph and appears to him in a dream again. So another dream. Joseph has like 3 times where an angel appears to him, when he's trying to figure out what to do with Mary after she's conceived the child, and then there when Herod is seeking the life of the child, and then now once Herod dies, the angel appears again. He says, "Rise and take the child and the mother, go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." Okay, so like it's all over. So now come back. And so out of Egypt I have called my son. And so there he goes. But then what happens? He heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod. So Archelaus was one of Herod's sons that Herod apparently didn't have killed. And he, again, historically is known to be as cruel as his father, or cruel in that similar line of his father. And so Joseph hears about this, and he's like, "Okay, I don't want to go to the region where Archelaus is ruling." And so he goes to Galilee, which was ruled by a guy named Herod Antipas, which I think was another son of Herod, but not as cruel, although still, like he reigns over Galilee until AD like 39 or something. So he was present, throughout the entire time of like Jesus' ministry and his trial and his crucifixion. So it's not like Herod Antipas was this great person. It's just that maybe he wasn't as bad as Archelaus. So anyway, so he went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth. So this is where things get a little strange. So that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, he shall be called a Nazarene. So this is an interesting thing. So this prophecy, he shall be called a Nazarene, is not found in the scriptures anywhere. And so some Bible people are like, what is Matthew talking about? Maybe he's talking about another prophet who just doesn't have his book in the scriptures. Some Bible people think that maybe Matthew is making a summary of other passages from the prophets that maybe are not as explicit, but clearly talk about some sort of branch that is going to come from the people. So you think of Isaiah 11, where the Lord says, a shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse, and from his buds a branch shall blossom. So a branch. So why does that matter? Because Nazareth comes from the word netzer, which just means branch. So netzer is branch. So Nazareth means branch town. Of course, we know it's the hometown of Mary, but it's a branch town. So in this prophecy of from his roots a bud shall blossom, or from his branch a bud shall blossom, there's taken from it is like, okay, well, there's going to be some sort of branch involved in the day of the Lord, or in the servant of the Lord coming to redeem his people. And so if Jesus is living in Nazareth, he's living in Branch Town, and so from Branch Town buds this blossom. And what blossom but the life of Jesus himself, the Son of the living God. So that could be a very plausible explanation of this line from Matthew as he's talking about, he shall be called a Nazarene. Anyway, so really cool thing. So just one more little point here. So in Egypt, Egypt is seen in the Old Testament as a place of refuge, strangely enough. It doesn't seem like it would make sense to, like it's the promised land is where Israel is. And yet Egypt, and for that matter, Egypt is also a place of slavery. And yet somehow Egypt is understood to be this place of refuge. So Genesis 12, Genesis 46, 1 Kings 11, and Jeremiah 26. And we also know that during New Testament times, there were Jewish colonies in Alexandria and in I can't remember the name of the other place, and I didn't write it down. But there were a couple of Jewish colonies in Egypt. So it seems like a really strange place that it would be a place of refuge, because we know it to be a place of slavery, and we know that the real place of refuge is in the Holy Land, especially in the holy city, Jerusalem. And yet at the same time, we can see that the Lord uses what is imperfect to bring about his goodness, his providence. So again, maybe this is getting back to the whole thing of like family life, is that there's an ideal. But when life gets messy, are we able to remain faithful to him? And so in some ways, maybe we could see Egypt as being like this is where life gets messy. And yet even in the messiness, can we see that God is there, that he is working out his plan, even though it doesn't always make sense to us. I think that can be a really great image of family life, especially when family life gets difficult. And messy and chaotic sometimes. And certainly sometimes family life for people cannot at all turn out the way that they anticipated that it would. And yet if we can remain faithful to the ideal of fear of the Lord, of fidelity to God, if we can remain faithful to that, the Lord can bring about his purposes, which fulfill every good promise that he's made to us. Okay, that sounds like an end to our Bible study, but it's not. We have one more reading, the more challenging of all three of them. So come back and tune in later. Peace.